morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have the members of the States of Emergency Subcommittee, Ms. Ellingson, Ms. White, and Board Member Cole. If the three of you would like to identify which of you will chair this particular subcommittee, that would be very helpful.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Wonderful.
Awesome. Kelsey, Ms. White, anybody? Is there anybody who is currently instituting anything that is utilizing emergency plans, possibly outside of Columbus City Schools?
I would say that the city of Columbus is in a state of emergency, a health emergency. I haven't had direct contact with or direct work with constructing that. That's something that's come out of the mayor's office predominantly. Happy to help. Welcome your leadership. As a board member, I assume you're also able to chair a subcommittee. That seems natural to me, but if you're uncomfortable with that, I'm happy to do it.
I'd love to cede that leadership to yourself.
Okay. Emily White, how do you feel about that?
Feel great.
You feel great. Okay, great. So, Dr. Rausch, will you give me a few pro tips here? How should I start us off?
So we're just going to keep this. I think there's three of us. I think that now that we've identified the chair of the subcommittee, I'll give you a kind of brief rundown of where we are policy-wise currently. I can then share with you a little bit of research that I've been able to do, and then we'll go ahead and allow you all to determine what next steps you wish to take if you're fine proceeding that way.
Okay.
Very good. So our current situation is that most of we don't have a policy for states of emergency per se. We do have a policy that does address pandemic specifically and asks and directs the district to adopt a pandemic plan. We also have a continuity of operations policy, or COOP as it's often referred to. That policy also is in place, and you'll find that the COOP or a emergency operations policy to be in place jurisdictions, be they school districts or institutions of higher education, have done a search. I'll go ahead and share a screen as far as what else we have. We also have within our purchasing policy, I apologize, a provision to allow the superintendent to make emergency purchases as necessary as well, and so that also comes into play. What's been unique about this situation is that a lot of while the board has taken action to suspend a few sections of their policies, all of those have been really kind of driven by statutory action through House Bill 197. The only other thing that's been done at this particular point in time is to grant the superintendent authority for hiring should that need arise. I don't believe that that's been used at all, particularly because the board has been able to continue to meet because of provisions put into House Bill 197 allowing virtual meetings. But that the board did give her that authority. It's similar to the authority given during the summer when the board is out of town to go ahead and make hiring and to pay those folks during those summer months, and then the board comes back and approves of those contracts and those hires at its meeting in August. And so that authority is to kind of allow, especially during the busy hiring season, to get folks on board fairly quickly so we're not waiting between board meetings, because all individuals go to the board for approval for those contracts because everybody's offered a contract. So it's the only other piece that we don't seem to have in place is we've had some conversations with folks. I think that where we are policy-wise, we're in a good position. I did find, and this is where I will now share my screen, there is a policy from Florida I found in St. Lucie, the first phrase there, in case of an emergency involving the welfare and safety of students and employees, the superintendent may suspend any part of these policies, but then they are required to go ahead and report the fact of and the reason for that to the school board. It's not necessarily driven by this particular pandemic, because obviously students have not been in the buildings there, but numbers certainly give some gives that the superintendent judgment to go ahead and do that where they need to do so. It doesn't define really what a state of emergency is here. Just a declared state of emergency doesn't indicate who declares said state of emergency. But this is the policy I've been able to find. And then after that, policies is identified by the superintendent if such suspension is necessary to implement guidance of state and federal agencies. So, is this kind of a unique situation? Does there need to be an overarching guiding policy? Doing so, especially if the board is able to continue to meet as it is. Now, it's important to note that the authority to meet virtually is in temporary law, and that authority will expire unless the General Assembly either places such possibility in permanent law, or you have to wait for the next emergency where they would go ahead and do an emergency provision. So that emergency may be. Would the board be able to move nimbly enough without a policy in place, or is the first question to the subcommittee is A, does the board really need a related to states of emergency? If the answer to that is no, then we can go ahead and give folks your morning back, and we'll report that back to the policy review committee at the next meeting. If the answer to that is we think that we do need something, the follow-up questions are what would said state of emergency be? How do we define a state of emergency? And then what are those policies or provisions of said policies that may need to be suspended, or do you just simply, or does the board wish to just simply grant the superintendent authority, as we saw with Port St. Lucie and in this resolution, that the superintendent can go ahead and suspend any policies in order to comply with, orders of a local, state, or federal agency, or other orders in order to kind of effectuate the smooth operation of the district?
My answer would be affirmative. Yes, there is a need for there's a definite need for this type of policy. I do like the language that I see in this St. Lucie policy. It gives some measure of idea about who to comply with, how to cooperate with other existing agencies. I think the only thing we need to do is take from some of that Iowa language that identifies what a disaster could be, or and then we just look at adding some additional language to the St. Lucie piece that incorporates being able to hire if necessary. Should the board not be able to meet as per executive authority, or something to that effect. Am I making any sense to anybody, by the way?
No, that totally makes sense. My only concern with the Port Lucie policy is paragraph 1 and 2. Paragraph 1 talks about emergency involving welfare or safety, and it says that the suspension of a policy doesn't have to be reported until the next board meeting. But number 2, which is emergency involving a closing of schools, that has to be reported to the board immediately. I don't see a reason for making that distinction. If there's an emergency that's suspending a policy, it seems that the board should be informed immediately.
I agree.
Yeah, because otherwise, if you're waiting for the next scheduled meeting, that might be a problem. But I do like the report the fact and the reason for the suspension, and that it expires at the next board meeting, basically to put the responsibility for that decision effectively back on the board where it belongs.
Agreed.
Ms. Ellenson, your mic is off.
Chairs will learn. They will learn. Board Member Cole, I was trying to talk to you.
Okay.
About the need for a policy. Clearly, the pandemic isn't over, and whatever lessons there are to be learned, that piece isn't in the past just yet. Do you think there, in terms of just creating a policy, do you think that will enable something better in terms of process for the board, as opposed to how things rolled out now without having one? Of course, having one is helpful so that everyone else knows the rules of the game. That's a critically important piece in any governmental entity. It's just communicating how things work. But do you think having an established policy will make your work as a board member and the district's work go more smoothly in the future?
I believe that the purpose of trying to establish this policy is for efficiency and effectiveness in the future. Yes, yes. I think the way that we and Dr. Roush spoke to it. I think the reason that we've been able to operate efficiently and effectively now is because we have executive authority by the governor, by the state, to be able to meet virtually, where under normal conditions, we would not be able to meet virtually. So, or let alone vote virtually. So with that in mind, I think this policy is important. Should in the future, we not have any executive authority or kind of governing authority to be able to meet virtually or otherwise under an emergency situation, that there's opportunity under very specific guidelines for, or at least a governance framework to give the superintendent mobility to do what he or she needs to do.
Okay, it's good enough for me.
Ms. White, any thoughts?
Yeah, I like all of that. I like the flexibility of this policy, but I'm wondering if you could provide some more background on specific types of emergencies that have come up in the past and any shortcomings you see of what the response might be. And I'm just thinking, like, the ones that I see as a parent are like, it's hot, the school's closed, or there's a fire or a water main break or something like that, the school is closed. And of course, we've also school shootings, the ones that have happened recently. I haven't gotten notice that my daughter was not going to get put on the bus, for instance. I'm just seeing, the potential that this kind of policy could be useful for other things, but I think that should be informed by what's the problem we're trying to solve here.
And thank you for stating that. My thought is that that's clear. That would be clearly designated in kind of the preamble language, right? That first and foremost establishes what a natural what a calamity represents, right? What some sort of and I'm trying to Dr. Rouse, can you move this language up? So in the case of emergency involving welfare, safety of students and employees, I think Iowa did it a little, because I see where you're making a point, that there are certain types of emergencies that constitute the superintendent having certain authorities. I think the purpose of this one specifically is to address something of this nature that allows the superintendent to have some authority in the absence of us having any efficacy.
Yeah. Although I do
hold on 1 second, but I'm sorry, Paul, yeah. Or did somebody? I thought I heard somebody say my name.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, I must have just been an echo. My apologies. Sorry.
Okay.
I kind of see these two policies as complementary. That the first one is, here are the emergency powers that happen until the matter could be brought before the board. But the second one is a full-blown, detailed board-level policy to respond to a specific emergency, which seems exactly how it should work. But those are kind of two different things. Whatever the emergency is, should obviously be informed by experts on that type of emergency. But it seems like also you shouldn't give somebody a blank check to be withdrawing policies and things like that. So keeping it as narrow as possible and getting it to the board as soon as possible and explaining the reasons for it are all super important for accountability. The health and welfare of employees and students sounds good to me in terms of being broad enough.
No, I hear you. I'm the last person who wants to take teeth out of the tiger's mouth. I promise. Well, first of all, Doc Rouse, let me ask this question, because have certain emergency authorities already set in place, and or administrative guideline for the superintendent to allow building closures under certain
Correct.
conditions, to
Correct.
building lockdowns. So we've already got that type of policy in place. This one is specifically designed for this type of instance where there's some sort of natural disaster, something that could be, again, put under the definition of a pandemic. Maybe it's important to identify definitively, denotatively, what a pandemic is in this policy. I think it's important to maybe spell out what, in the event that the board is not able to meet, what then does the superintendent have authority to do? That also, by the way, includes, Ms. White and Kelsey, making sure that you are informing the board in real time about your decision and rationale.
So again, yes, there are certainly policies in place for, well, I'll call them kind of one-off calamities, whether it's a snow day or it's a heat day. This is really the purpose of this subcommittee, and the purpose of this particular policy, as it was brought up, was to look at states of emergency where a state of emergency has been declared for some reason, and by which entity. And I think that's a question mark. Is that a local state of emergency declared by the mayor or by the local health commissioner? Is it a state levels state of emergency, governor or the health director, a federal state of emergency declared by the president? Then this policy kicks in. Otherwise, this policy does not kick in. We kind of operate, exist within policy.
I agree, Kelsey. I mean, give us some thought on, because this is, we do this call every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with the Department of Health that gives us the update. But I would imagine that the mayor took his authorities from the governor, who took his authorities from the federal government. So in my mind, this would encompass all of these types of groups. But how is the city defined a state of emergency, if at all? Maybe there can be some alignment there.
I would need to do some research to give you that answer. I know that there was a collaborative approach in the way that it was done. Thinking back to the cancellation of the Arnold, for example, that was a decision that was stood upon very good local knowledge about what that event meant for Columbus, but also was made in partnership with the governor's office and the Ohio Department of Health. So I think there is great value in acknowledging that, or incorporating that, if there are other jurisdictions that into which the district falls that are declaring states of emergencies, that perhaps that enable your policy to be put into action. One question I do have, though, is say, for example, with the virtual meetings, when that became possible through the state's changes, did the board have to go back and change anything within its own policies to actually be able to do that? Or was it just by default, the board began to act in a new way by meeting virtually?
No, we began to meet virtually immediately. I can't remember. I feel like I'm not sure if we made some sort of amendment or addendum, but I don't think that we did.
I don't recall that you did. I believe that once House Bill 197 went into effect, you all met.
Yes, I think all I'm recalling from a memory standpoint is conversation with Jennifer around some of that activity, but we went ahead and we took executive authority to meet. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we made no amendments or addendums to any of our policy at all.
And that could be, as the bylaws subcommittee gets underway, I know that there's, I think, two of you were on that as well. That could be something to kind of discuss or raise at that particular point in time, where there needs to be some mention of that if that authority is granted, or at least have it in the back of all of our minds that if that's given to public entities permanently, which is a possibility, certainly. If this goes well statewide, I know there's already legislation to allow other entities to do this. It could certainly spill over to local governments as well.
I think what I was thinking about, where I was going with that line of questioning, was everyone knows that time matters in a crisis. And my work on this committee for 2 years policy. And so where I was going with that is competitive bidding requirements are. It makes sense in my mind the board not to have to change its policies to be able to act with new necessary flexibility to carry out business, and that instead it would follow by default if like the state or federal government waived some sort of requirement, that you would just be able to go ahead with it. Another example would be the congregate setting for fewer children, or the requirement that the students be present when they receive their food. These were, I believe, USDA waivers that were put in place to enable changes that were really needed to keep people safe. If this isn't an issue, I don't want to make one of it. My question is, when these changes enabling flexibility and safer behaviors have come down from other jurisdictions, from other levels of government, have you been able to run with it, still respecting board policy, or have you had to take what may be an unnecessary step to ensure we're abiding by our own rules, but also getting to where we need to be in terms of our practices?
Thank you for that question. I believe that we have done a good job of staying in compliance, of making sure that whether it's from an omnibus standpoint, that when law or some sort of authoritative governance changes by way of Ohio Revised Code or otherwise, that we abide by that, and then we appropriately amend our policies to reflect that, which has been a large part of your work in the past couple of years you've been on this committee. The other piece is to answer your question, yes. When it comes, and today, I mean, what we're going through now is a perfect example of how we've allowed ourselves to be flexible to any day-to-day changes or overall arching changes that have allowed us to have flexibility to give food, to distribute Chromebooks, to meet as a board and vote as a board. The answer is in the affirmative, yes. So I don't think that aspect of what you bring up, as you said, is really an issue. I think this policy, though, is helpful in the future to allow the superintendent some authorities under defined conditions of emergency, state of emergency. And again, in defining state of emergency as something that falls under a natural disaster, a pandemic, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm. What, thinking about what's in these policies we have as models in front of us, but also in an ideal scenario, what powers do the boards retain to object to a waiver of a policy?
Rephrase that.
So
unpack that for me a bit.
Yeah. So, Dr. Rausch, if I flounder, please help me. But in here, it mentions that in a state of emergency, you can waive certain policies. My question is that there's also a school board members governing these districts, and there may not be consensus around the need to waive a policy. Perhaps it's important, and I'm just trying to get after what sort of back and forth is there between automatic waivers that the superintendent would like to carry forward, and the school board's ability to respond back and say, actually, no, we'd like this one in place. I think that conversation is important. You're, two different branches governing
authority, period. The superintendent, treasurer, and internal auditor, under their respective roles, are the managing, day-to-day managing authorities. We are the governance body by virtue of Ohio Revised Code. We are also the governance body and leadership visioning body by virtue of our policies and our bylaws, etc. The way that we've made this work, and Eric, feel free to clarify or chime in, but the way that we've made this work is by defining the policy framework and subsequently allowing for what's called administrative guidelines. Administrative guidelines then give some measure of freedom to, first of all, take direction, get direction from us, and then take action. It could be through designing a strategic plan. Maybe as this policy, one of the policies alludes, I believe it's Iowa, that asks for some sort of plan, pandemic plan, or to abide by some sort of governing or overarching pandemic plan. That could be something that we already do that, by the way, not so much for a pandemic, but definitely for some sort of state of emergency, whether it's with the Homeland Security. I believe it's Homeland Security. We're in partnership with some things on. We work very quietly and privately with them on designing protocols around that type of stuff. So to answer your question, we have policy that provides the framework, but then we have administrative guideline that has to operate within that policy framework, but gives the superintendent or any of our direct reports the opportunity to flexibly administer that policy, if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think what caught my attention was the parallels between a state of emergency and also the summer breaks, in the way that they provide additional authority to the superintendent to carry out business. So my question was around whether in a state of emergency, the board would still like to retain some authority, some check on that.
That the superintendent or any direct report is required to give regular of any decision making in real time, or give some sort of regular update about how they're dealing with a state of emergency, should policies be waived or allowed to be superseded. Is that what you're saying?
Slightly. I think it's even before that. I mean, yes, communication to the board is critical in any sort of time that we're considering. And so updates are important, but I'm questioning the procedure, the process afforded to the board to say, actually, though we do want you to take care of business and we've given you additional authority to do that, we actually would prefer that this policy stay in place. So it's not so much about how you learn about it, it's about how the board would be able to ensure that they have a check on what kinds of changes are made. Dr. Rausch, am I making any sense?
I think I know where you're going. I think that the check that exists here is simply the fact that the superintendent they directly report to the board, and so if they or they suspend X and then inform the board that they suspended X, the board may look and say, yeah, you're going to go and undo that action because we're not in support of that. The superintendent has a decision to make, which is probably if they want to keep their job, they're going to go ahead and do what the board wants them to do. That's because
fair enough.
Their boss. That's their boss. So it's a little different. It's not like the superintendent's here as an executive and the board is over here as like a legislative authority. So that's if the board doesn't like what the superintendent does, the superintendent will then kind of step back and go, yeah, we're gonna reverse course on that.
I've got an idea for how to at the next board meeting, which essentially puts it directly on the board to ratify the specific actions. Either the board owns it or whenever that meeting is over. And I think that the specific emergency declaration for the model of a best practice for how the board can take policy. Just another suggestion too, to go with this, superintendent may suspend and inform. I think we want to include a public notice and comment as well, so that members of the public can inform the board even further about whatever policy is going to be on the table. But ultimately, then that next board be where they either own it or it disappears. But what I like about having that, then the board can have that deliberative process. What's the right fit for this particular emergency? For what is an emergency should absolutely be as broad, but should cut off sharply at the next board meeting. And to the board of whatever decision has been made. Limiting it to what other government might not meet the needs of our urban, all levels of government from state to federal concerns is a large urban school district. Thoughts or even interest in whether or not an emergency involving welfare and safety of that the superintendent might on the ground.
Thank you, Emily, for that. This is specifically to the last thing you just mentioned. Again, have policy in place already with day-to-day emergencies and things up as challenger issue. Again, down, students have to be evacuated, a school has to be locked in place that immediately deal with those things that are unique to the safety and quality of education during our school hours. This policy is specifically designed to identify in this little group here and nationally that this COVID-19 situation constitutes a state of emergency situation that was identified by the federal government, acknowledged by our 50 state municipalities, and subsequently executed as such. This is kind of what we're trying to operate in the framework, but we do have policy in place that addresses those other very specific needs that are student and staff centric, if I'm making any sense. Dr. Rouse?
Nope, you made perfect sense, sir.
Okay. So, to go back to Emily too, I like, again, the language that talks about the temporary aspect. There was just a recent memorandum of understanding. So our final quarter, our third quarter, we passed Tuesday to May 1. But in working with, we agreed that we would extend quarter 4 until September 15th and appropriate the necessary compensation and additional compensation up to a certain hourly threshold for them to be able to do their jobs and meet the needs of our kids. And that is only, the term of that agreement is only to September 30 of 2020. So when you're talking about, to your point, Kelsey, even, when you're talking about giving the superintendent that kind of latitude to be able to do that, but inform the board in real time of what those possible issues could be, I think that that's where that delicate dance happens, but where something has to be done. We have to have some measure of, especially if we're not able to meet. If we're able to meet, it's a different situation. But if we're not able to meet, then where does the superintendent have the ability to make some necessary adjustments to accommodate that state of emergency situation?
So
I
just,
think,
and I hear you on all of that, and I applaud the recent decision-making process that led to that necessary decision about the quarterly grading. My only point is that is way too big of a decision to have been made on an emergency basis before the board voted, and so obviously the board was going to have to ratify that immediately. But it could even be broken down to say, okay, an emergency has been declared. Now the board is going to agree on what the process is next. And even this emergency declaration going forward, it should definitely have a sunset provision. Anything like that should, just as a best practice. But in terms of a policy framework of do what has to be done to keep people safe immediately, and then get to the board, and then decide what both the process and the substance is going to be going forward. But
I don't disagree. I think either policy state that. I think this St. Lucie piece states that with all clarity.
yeah,
We are not in disagreement.
cool. So are we ready to cut and paste?
Yeah, basically.
Put a proposal out there.
That then I can certainly share again, and so it can be brought to the PRC in May as a report out, if you're all good with that.
I would recommend, while we're here, although I appreciate your editing efforts, I would recommend collapsing paragraph 1 and 2 into one, and then having it be in case of an emergency involving the welfare and safety of students and employees. Because I don't think it should be suspension to the members of the school board, and it will be presented at the next school board meeting, and that suspension shall expire at the time of such report, or maybe not the time of such report, but at the next board meeting, unless continued in effect by the actions of the school board.
It is always great to have an attorney.
Important that we identify what a state of emergency comprises. That we give some definition to what that of when that would occur.
Do you think welfare and safety is too broad or too narrow in terms of a definition of an emergency?
No, because that's what an emergency immediately disrupts.
Seems like we're having a conversation. Emily, just back to what you said before, I think you're correct. It's important not to limit or rest that we're having right here. It seems to me that it would make some sense that if we need to define any sort of indicators of the fact that a state of emergency does exist, that a threat to welfare and safety does exist, that we perhaps list that those might be indicators. That the city or state or federal government has declared that. Doesn't mean that that the board must declare one because of that, but that would be evidence of threat to welfare and safety.
So to me, the immediate the clause language would then say something to the effect of is but is not limited to, and that's an easy insert. Is but not limited to executive, federal, or local, municipal, whatever. I think we can say is but is not limited to. But at the end of the day, an emergency is something that immediately affects the safety and welfare of students and employees. What else would? That's fine.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
I think you could, instead of doing a separate, well, I mean, you could do a separate definition section, but you could also just say, in case of an emergency involving an imminent threat to the welfare or safety of students or employees. That one might need an or.
Yeah.
So are we happy with that? I mean, I've heard discussion on either side of the need to specify what an emergency is, and I think what we have there now, Emily, captures the spirit of it. But board member, tell me if we've met the need in your mind to describe what an emergency is, or if that perhaps is something we bring to PRC, the overall committee, to have further discussion on.
Okay, so as used in this policy, a state of emergency shall include but not
Well,
be
do we
limited.
need this, I guess, is the question.
Do we need what?
Do we need this up above still,
Absolutely.
do you think?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I think it's clear enough that it's, as long as it's something that we know presents imminent threat or danger to the welfare of students and staff, I think that's clear enough. I
I've got
don't
one
know
other.
that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I'm trying to think too about, there are going to be some states of emergency declared by the federal government or the state of Ohio that have like literally nothing to do with students or schools. I wonder if we might even want to narrow the emergency power to those necessary to protect the welfare or safety of students or employees due to an imminent threat.
You gotta turn on PBS or something. Or can you maybe do your scholastic things? One more and then let's do some scholastic.
So after superintendent, after students and employees, then if necessary to protect the welfare and safety of students due to the threat. That way you're really tying these extraordinary hours to tailoring them to meeting whatever threats posed.
I think your critique of the include those if they're, because of precisely what you said. As we talk, I'm becoming more comfortable with the broad language.
I think it merits a little further discussion. I'm someone who likes the idea of having buffer. I think, again, as used in this policy, a state of emergency shall include but not be limited to any state of emergency declared by the city of Columbus, the state of Ohio, or the federal government. And then you have in the additional clause, students and employees, if necessary, to protect the welfare or safety due to threat of employees, of students.
No.
You're good.
Do students.
A framework specific to what is designed to do. Then clause 1 breaks it out in greater. If it's necessary to protect our kids and our staff, this is what the superintendent has authority to do, but must communicate and report to the board in real time in the process. And it's suspended at the next board meeting. I'm totally okay with that language. I think it's important to keep this preamble language at the top.
I just want to point out, though, that, when the tornado goes through, the state of emergency is declared like 2 or 3 days later. It's both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It's going to include stuff that's definitely not a state of emergency that would demand suspending policies, but it's also not going to include stuff like a bomb threat or a school shooting or something.
I don't know
like
what,
that
at that point, there's already policies in place to handle those issues. And so I don't know, this is where, from the board's perspective, what policies would need to be suspended at that point in time. I mean, I think these are for more of a longer term.
Absolutely.
Kind of, this is a longer term kind of an approach. Those we have policies to address those particular issues, Ms. White, and I think we have procedures to handle those. I don't know what policies we would need to suspend in that. And I don't think that, I'm not going to, I don't think that, I can't think of any policy that if we had to, I think of snow days as a good example. We declare a calamity day. Students don't go to school. Number of staff don't go into work. I get to still go to work, but that's okay because I've always had a job where I get to go to work if it's snowy. I don't know what policies we would need to necessarily suspend at that particular point in time, because we're used to how that happens. We've got that in place. We've got all the parts and pieces in place. I think it's for these larger kind of, we're out of school now for several months, and we have to maintain social distancing in this kind of an example, or half the city's been wiped out because of an awful tornado that's torn through. What do we need to suspend in that particular point in time? Are there some policies that we need to suspend in order to make sure that we can policies regarding moving staff and moving students around at that point that we may need to suspend in order to get students from the school that's now gone and to different schools? So,
I just don't.
Some of those guidelines as far as which school you can go to.
Yeah. But I don't see how you can have a generic policy that can anticipate what the appropriate response or what the appropriate delegation of authority should be to meet any kind of like months-long closure thing. I think you're still going to come back to, put the Band-Aid on before the matter gets to the board, and then it's going to have to be some more specific policy that has input from subject matter experts.
So the first piece is as Eric said, we have any number of policy in place that address very specific kind of what we would look at as conventional states of emergency that most of us are very aware of. Even a bomb threat, even bombing, student shootings. We have protocol and trainings that we do, activities, actions that we coordinate and execute on. To kind of back what Eric is saying, this is designed for something else that is more in line with this. Now, what I think is helpful to add to this policy, because to me, this is ceding authority only under the condition that we're not able to meet as a board to affect some sort of governance or provide direction. I think that's important to put somewhere in the preamble language. And that's how you keep the teeth in the tiger's mouth, number one. And at the same time, give the authorities necessary to the day-to-day governing people, the day-to-day manager, to do their jobs. I think they encapsulate the spirit and framework, good governance framework of what would need to take place. Then maybe we include something that asks for some sort of clarity on administrative guidelines via a plan or something to that effect, should something happen. But again, that's the reporting agent, right? They persuaded me, but I think we're good. I just feel like we're good.
8, 3, 4, and 5 then, because odds are those are going to already be passed by other things, and also they're a little bit dated.
I would also argue there was another one that had to do with, I think it was number 7. Already in policy, it already states that anytime superintendent is used, it means superintendent or designee. That's already, you don't need 7 because of that already exists. And so you're saying get rid of 3, 4, and 5,
Yes.
Ms. White?
Before you do that, let me just.
Should I do this now?
Is the Red Cross really going to be the appropriate emergency management entity? And also, in the event of a riot or similar condition, it has the principal cooperating with law enforcement. I just, once again, I think that's
principal shall cooperate with any managing authority. I don't know. I don't know that it needs to be as specific as the Red Cross. I think it could say, for example, the Red Cross, but I think it's important to at least identify that there has to be some measure of cooperation.
I don't want to hear that. off the TV if I hear that.
But this is directed to the principal, though. Is there not going to be some other, as you mentioned, detailed policy to address all sorts of bad things that could happen at the school? I mean, that's pretty granular to get down to the principal level in a policy like this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the superintendent would direct the principal.
Yeah, the superintendent shall.
Moving the last sentence of paragraph 4 altogether.
Why I love this so much? Because there's a Wesley in it.
What show is
There's a new one.
The administrator, a designee, and appropriate staff shall be present during any time that district facilities and/or resources under supervision are in use for emergency reasons. And Eric, you said clause number 5, we have something in place.
Clause number 7, we already have something in place for that.
I'm specifically asking about clause 5.
I don't know that anytime we have district facilities open, we have people on site for those facilities.
Well, to me, this number 5 is important to establish. I think number 5 should be included. There should be some person in authority there who is representative of the district.
Designate appropriate staff.
That's fine. And that's something that he or she can designate in the future through administrative guideline. But we've got a good framework.
Mm-hmm. We've already got this framework's already in place. So it's kind of stating current practice.
If number 5 is?
Number 5, if you write it like this, because we when we have buildings open, different individuals are designated to make sure that buildings are unlocked, that folks are there. I mean, that's already in place. So this.
Okay. Then if we did keep it, then what is the policy that we could cite in parentheses that we could parenthesize to?
It's SOP. It's standard operating procedure.
Then, Doc, I think it's important to have clarity
in the policy.
Yes, sir. Yes.
If I could make a recommendation there, though, the having staff be present is making a commitment to, like, a substantial commitment to resources. Like, what if the gym was used to store, emergency medical supplies? Now you've suddenly got appropriate staff present anytime resources are used for emergency or resources. That the superintendent shall designate appropriate staff to ensure the security of, or something like that.
That's actually, I like that even better. Because as I'm thinking of the people in the building, and you raise a good point. If we're just storing something in a building, we wouldn't necessarily want staff on. The way that's written, somebody's going to have to be in that school building the whole time we store something there. So.
Yeah, and there is a policy on. I haven't looked at it since I've been in the policy review committee, but whenever we've wanted to work with the PTO to have a school event, there's a form and a process to use the school building.
Correct.
And because it's a public place,
it's the building use facility. It's under 7,000. Yeah.
Yeah. You have 2B ensure, so if you remove the B, I think it'll be grammatically correct.
Thank you very much.
For number 7 or for number 3?
Well, number 7, I feel we can get rid of. If we're all good with that, we already have policy that directs that. Superintendent's defined in the bylaws 0-100. So.
Yep.
And I guess we have this last sentence in 4 and 3. We just need to figure out how we want to.
I'm okay with the strike in number 4.
Ms. Ellingson, you good with that?
I'm fine with that. Yes. Were you asking about 6?
And 3, you said 3 is redundancy.
Well, 3. I mean, we retain control of pupils until we release them. I think
it's a redundancy. So yes.
I would argue yes, it's a redundancy.
Okay, get rid of it.
Everybody good with getting rid of this? All right. I'll renumber meetings, you may call, so you're
Mhm.
covered. We have clarity there, emergency, special, regular. And then we define a state of emergency. And I mean, if we want, I can even put this at the end. I've seen definitions both ways. I don't care where it goes, but we
You
I'm
could
okay with
definition.
it at the top.
Yeah, you could also beef up the definition by drawing in some of the language from the first paragraph to actually define. I mean, you could define it there, and then do the shall include but not be limited to.
So in this part here, is it an and or an or here?
Or no, I'm sorry. I think that you need to state of emergency shall be a situation presenting an emergency includes but is not limited to, and then the rest of it.
So do we still need all of this in number one? You want me to just keep the language in? Since we've now
Yeah.
defined as we defined a state of emergency, do we really need all of that still there? But
I think the only one you can remove is the involving through employees, because we still need the if necessary. But now that I'm looking at if necessary, I think you need to put to the extent necessary.
You need an of instead of to after welfare or safety.
to the extent necessary to protect the welfare or safety of students, thank you, and employees due to the threat. Superintendent may suspend any part of these policies, provided the superintendent shall immediately report the fact of and the reason for suspension to the board and present said facts and reasons at the next board meeting. The suspension shall expire at the time of such report unless continued in effect by actions of the board.
Awesome.
In case of an emergency, the superintendent may close any school or all schools. The members of the board shall be informed immediately of any event or condition which requires the closing of any schools of the district. The superintendent shall cooperate with emergency management authorities in the event of a natural or man-made disaster. The superintendent shall designate appropriate staff to ensure the security of district facilities and/or resources under their supervision. This is awkward. We got to go back here. Shall designate appropriate staff to ensure the security of district facilities and/or resources under their supervision in use for emergency reasons. There we go. If in any case or condition not covered by these policies, the superintendent shall base the decision on his or her best judgment.
Now, let me ask this, as you correct those numbers
So
too.
get away from that dresser.
Instead of under their supervision, could we make it under district supervision? For number, what you have is number 5, which would actually be number 4.
Okay. Shall designate appropriate staff to ensure the security.
I know it seems a bit redundant, but I just like to be really clear about that.
It seems like that's trying to get into like movable things that the district might have. Supervision is kind of a weird. I don't know what resources are under district supervision. Is it staff? Maybe
it's staff, it's students,
okay.
It's property, it's all things. Yes.
Okay.
And we have policies that designate exactly what that is.
Ensure the security of district facilities and/or resources under district supervision and use for emergency reasons. Okay.
So one thing, do we need to include something about how the superintendent would do? That's my second
component as well.
I think it's important to codify how you keep the public informed. I mean, for example, the way the district's utilized its website during this time has been very, very good. We should continue that.
So maybe it's a part of a second sentence in number 2, in clause 2.
But once again, then
The
we're getting into the,
superintendent will.
the problem though is number 2 is still that lingering, that only applies to building closures. Do we want to inform the public of not only building closures, but any suspension of board policies as well? So then we should just put the same language in paragraph 1, right?
I think that's correct, putting it in 1.
So isn't the presentation of the facts and reasons at the next board meeting kind of giving isn't that the public notice provision?
But if you want to get feedback and have people like find out before the meeting so they can offer input at the board meeting, which is really like the best way to provide that public input under our system, then it's got to be a public notice before.
For example, if all the buildings were closed, you'd want the public to have a way to know not to go to the buildings before the next.
Such announcement of state of emergency. Public notice of such state of emergency.
I think the notice should also include any particular policies that are being suspended.
Any suspension of policies, is that sufficient there?
I personally don't know if that's necessary but I do like the fact that, yes, there is a community public notice accountability, and that the superintendent shall provide public notice of such state of emergency. Then it says the superintendent shall present said facts and reasons at the next board meeting.
If we pull the public notice part out to its own paragraph, then we're very clear that the presentation at the board meeting is not going to be the public notice, it's going to be the preceding paragraph, which is the declaration or the suspension of the policies.
So you want it to be some. This is getting very long, so I'm starting to think just start.
Yeah, I think the last 2 sentences belong in paragraph 1. The public notice part is the part that is a little bit something different. I think could be pulled out into its own.
Is that true though? I mean, it's saying that the superintendent shall notify the board immediately.
Mm-hmm.
The initial notification to the board is prior to their meeting.
Yes.
And
Correct.
The notice to the
be,
public should also be prior to their meeting.
Yeah.
Public notice should be its own clause.
Yeah, because otherwise then you've got the to the board, not necessarily the public.
So this is the one that's still the question mark. There's
Policies that are being suspended.
I agree.
I'm outvoted.
I'll leave it here, and it can be discussed by PRC. And
yeah.
So I can see that we have about 10 minutes left in our allotted time, and I do want to just go back to the point we mentioned earlier, which is how the superintendent invokes a state of emergency. So it's important. I mean, this is all necessary to have in the policy, but the first step to be able to declare such a thing
it's just me, but I feel like that's kind of it's given its appropriate guidelines. Again, it's stated at the top. So if we're not able to meet as a board, the policy shall only be in effect until such time as the Board of Education is able to meet in either an emergency, special, or regular meeting. Then it goes into what a state of emergency is definitively, and then explains with clarity what that all entails.
I feel like it's kind of a matter of, you know, they can declare the state of emergency, and you almost are taking your definition and moving it down to that's what it is. So it's, do we just define it, or do you say
I mean, or it's that the superintendent may declare a state of emergency
declare
in a
state of
situation
emergency
involving imminent threat?
for a situation involving an imminent? However you guys want to do it. It's to me, it kind of runs the same way. One defines it. One it's defined, and that's it. It's the definition. The other is the superintendent has to take some kind of proactive action within said definition. So
Do we want it to be in writing? Just so that there's no confusion of like phone calls were made.
I really like, I mean, I know we spent a lot of time crafting that second small paragraph there, but yeah, I think you're doing it now. Pulling that language is, yeah, achieves both goals there.
Maybe we need to say that the suspension shall expire at the time of the next board meeting, instead of simply the emergency is made. I think that language was from the original policy that we're trying to.
it was. So say that again. How do you want me to rephrase it?
So instead of the suspension shall expire at the time of such report, as continued, we should put the suspension shall expire at the conclusion of the next board meeting following such report.
Did I get it right?
You said
So do I still need the definition up here, or are we stating it two ways?
Where do you feel like this is necessary to remove?
Well, we kind of defined, it's the same definition here as down here. So I'm good either way. I'm fine leaving it in place, and
I like to leave it in place.
I mean, it is slightly redundant in my opinion, but I don't think it does any harm as constructed.
So one is preamble. Hold on. So the but the top is clearly about definition. It's clearly about what denotatively we are describing as a state emergency. Number one, clause 1 goes right into what actionable steps can be taken by the superintendent should he or she declare state of emergency. So where it made most from a purpose standpoint, the other clause, first clause, is all about actionable steps in accordance to what a state of emergency is. I think it's important to keep that preamble language, that definition language.
Mommy. Where's mommy?
Okay.
if I'll go ahead and get it into board docs. I think the numbers will become letters, but that's semantics. I'm sure that I'm interested in it more probably than any of you are, and board docs fixes on the back end anyway. But I'll put this in board docs. We'll give it a temporary policy number, because board docs will give it its own number, or Neola will give it its own number when we get it through if it's enacted by the board, they'll number it, but we'll go ahead and give it a generic number, which is their request whenever we kind of do our own policies.
Okay.
You all, Ms. Ellingson is chair. Is that amenable to you?
It is. I don't think I need to seek a motion to adjourn since we didn't really.
I noted the time we convened. So, but if you're all, if this is good, I'll go ahead and work this up. I'll get it out to all of you for another glance. Make sure I didn't make any other typos or anything there, and then I'll get it out to the PRC, and we'll get it posted for the next meeting.
Any objections to that?
None was.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, stay safe. Paul, we are done.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Stay healthy. Thank you.